Thank you to the friends of the Jonathan Bourne Public Library for having me come down, and thank you all for coming out. I got to tell you, I've been very impressed with how hardy certain New Englanders like you are. Because as I had several talks this past week at night, mind you, and not down in the Cape where it's 5 to 6.5 degrees warmer. But good turnouts all those nights, and I was very impressed. I said, that's how you tell who the hardy New Englanders really are, when they come out in the middle of January. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. How many of you have been at one of my previous talks here at the Jonathan Bourne Public Library? That's good. That's good. That's good. Not good enough, but that's good. No, thank you. Thank you all for joining me. So I'm going to talk to you about my most recent book. And the one thing I like to say before jumping in is that this is a book that is, look, any book and anybody who writes a book, I don't care who you are and what the subject is, if you spend a year or 2 or 3, in some cases many, many more years, working on a project, any project really, right? You have to some extent, love what you're doing or you wouldn't be doing it. But this in particular is something that has really great affection for me because while I have certainly enjoyed my work, my job, the past now almost 30 years, traveling around every corner of New England, from northern Maine to the tip of P-Town, and you name it, and getting to know this area, even though I grew up here, being able to delve deeper into some of the great stories and being able to tell the stories of New England. This project is different in that this is not about places. Obviously, each one of these people that I'll be talking about lives in a certain place, so that's certainly a part of it. But this is a book specifically about the most memorable people that I've met in my almost 30 years of traveling around New England. But I say most memorable people, obviously these were stories that stuck with me right away. They were stories that I wanted to do, and they stuck with me right away. But more importantly, they were people that not only stuck with me right away, but stayed with me forever. All of the people that I'm sharing with you tonight, this afternoon, are people with whom I was not only impacted by their story, but I'm still in touch with all of these people, minus 1 or 2 who sadly have gone on, but they have become friends of mine in many cases, and that just doesn't happen. I've done hundreds and hundreds of stories in those 30 years, and it's rare. It's much more rare that you stay in touch with people. Sometimes you do for a little while and you keep in touch, but these are people I can 1, 2, 3 last week. So they're people who I stay in touch with now and count as friends. So this is very special. It's very different. So these are their stories. All of them share something in common too. If you are at all familiar with some of my pieces traveling around New England, you may or may not know that almost always it includes a stop at a local diner, right? Right. And sometimes it includes a stop at a local general store, right? Which I've written another whole book about. Sometimes it is about my deep, abiding love and being a passionate ally of public libraries. Maybe some of you saw my piece just about a year ago, which I do every 5 years on public libraries today and the challenges that are facing public libraries. And I don't have to tell you, any of you in this room, least of all Colleen, what some of the challenges are that public libraries have never even faced before. But all of those places, sometimes it's about, I often find myself on a local bike trail, rail trail, recreational trail that has been something that the local area, oftentimes not just one town, but a consortium of communities have helped create, right? There's some wonderful ones here on the Cape. We're only, a mile from one of the most famous in the country, right? The Shining Sea. So all of those places have something in common. Every single one of them, from the diners to the libraries to the trails to the general stores, they all are about community. Each one of them is what we call a third place in American life. These are places that are not work, they're not home, they are separate, but they are vital places. They are community gathering places. That's why we call them third places. And that's what, in many ways, over the last 15 years anyway, has really impelled most of my stories that I've done. And it is something that all of these folks have in common. So you will see that. You will see the diners that we stop at. And you know, the book, the full title is Journeys Through the Heart and Travels Through the Heart. Who titled that? Travels Through the Heart and Soul of New England. Stories of struggle, resilience, and triumph. So I'm going to, the book, I don't separate it like this. The book is really just a grand tour through New England, where I lay out the route right off the top. But for this purpose, our talk, I'm going to give you some examples of some stories that come under each one of those headings, like struggle. So sometimes struggle can be about very, very big things. Sometimes it can be about not just one person, but many people, an entire community, an entire way of life. And that is certainly the case in America's oldest and most storied seaport, Gloucester. And I know you know, without my saying, that the way of life, of course, is fishing. And the way of life has become a struggle. Look, fishing is also one of the two most dangerous jobs in the world for anybody to do at any time in history. But you know that with Gloucester, Gloucester became something of ground zero in terms of the struggle to maintain and preserve the fishing industry in the wake of the federal efforts starting about 50 years ago to help arrest the decline of the cod fishery in New England. It started with the cod fishery. It grew out to about another 12 or 13 species. But in any event, it was those efforts. It continues to be those efforts, which, by the way, I'm not getting into. First of all, it's way above my pay grade. But there's no definitive answer to share with you. I mean, you can go online right now, and you won't have a definitive answer on whether or not those 50 years of struggles and restrictions and limitations on the amount of fish that you can catch on any given trip are proving effective. We don't know. There's some evidence that points to that they are. There's some that points to that they're not. There's some that's completely indeterminate. I'll give you one single area that we know for certain what the effect is, and that is the effect on families and their fishing business. That has been affected to the tune of, well, why not give you the numbers, right? So it is estimated that in 1900, this is the 1920s, but it's estimated that in and around 1900, right, there were about 2,500 family-owned fishing vessels operating in Gloucester. Now, that doesn't mean 2,500 boats were out on the water on any given day. It just means that there were 2,500 boats, it's estimated, that families were making a living off of fishing. Now, that very term, family-owned fishing boat, would have been a term in 1900 that people would have been like, why are you saying family-owned? Like, who else is going to own? How have things changed, right? So today, family-owned fishing boats represent a fraction of the boats that fish out of Gloucester Harbor. Today, most of the boats fishing out of Gloucester are what they call corporate boats, business boats. These are boats that are owned by business interests. Sometimes there are multiple boats, sometimes multiple boats in multiple harbors. But the point is, 2,500 family-owned boats in and around 1900. And today, of course, the fact that the inner harbor is kind of caving in and falling apart is evidence of the fact that in 1970, that number was estimated to be about 1,500, and those are both estimates. In 2023, the last year for which there is definitive number available, not an estimate, the number of family-owned fishing boats had shrunk to 79. So it's disappearing. That's disappearing. That way of life this isn't about now arresting the decline of the cod fishery. There is nothing that's going to arrest the decline of family-owned fishing boats and family fishing in Gloucester. That decline's not going to be arrested. Does that go down to zero? I doubt it. If it gets down any lower than it already is, does it really matter? It's functionally zero. It's functionally zero, right? And for people like Joe Sanfilippo, who I count as a wonderful friend, it's crushing. It's crushing. You can say that, yeah, I understand the effort to try to save the cod fishery, and maybe it would have gone anyway. It did in Newfoundland. Gone. Gone. You may know that. But he was driven from fishing as a way of life 10 years ago. still gets to make a living on the water, which not a lot of people can say. And there's his boat now, right over his shoulder, right there. But that's not a fishing boat. That is the Boatport. It's a cruise boat out of Gloucester Harbor. And so he still stays in the water, says he misses fishing every single day, but couldn't do it anymore. You got 3 or 4 mouths to feed. You got a mortgage to pay. You got bills to pay. You got groceries to buy. You can't work with the uncertainty of the rules and regs, as they say. You can't have a boat that's all fueled up and baited up and ready to go fishing for 4 days on Stellwagen Bank for mackerel, and then find out overnight, literally have a ping on your phone at 2 a.m. that there's a rolling closure for George's and Stellwagen Bank. And that means that you now have a crew who's supposed to arrive at the dock in 3 hours. You're going to have to pay them anyway now for 4 days. You are going to have bait you're going to have to dump in the water that you've paid almost $2,000 for. You can't run a life that way. So he didn't, and he retired. But here's the thing about Joe. He's one of these people, and thank God we have them, right, who are relentlessly optimistic. You don't necessarily get it from that expression, but I think, although in his defense, I think at that moment I was asking Joe, do you miss fishing? And he said, every day. And I don't know any former fisherman who would say otherwise. But what he has done with that optimism is something that addresses struggle, and it may seem ridiculously quixotic and like it would never work, but he's doing it anyway. And what he realizes is that, when those family-owned fishing boats disappear, it's not the physical boats themselves, right, that are the problem when those disappear. You can buy another boat. You can get another boat. You know what you can't replace? It's the institutional knowledge of fishing that is handed down from generation to generation that can never be replaced. Joe started fishing, learned to fish when he was 12 years old from his older brother. His older brother, Ricky, had learned from their dad. Their dad had learned from their grandfather. Their grandfather had learned from their great-grandfather. That's how the knowledge of fishing was passed along in Gloucester. That institutional pipeline is now at a trickle, and it may be completely dry sooner or later. You don't take a course. There's no course offered at a local community college, Commercial Fishing 101. There's no book on Amazon that you can order that is fishing for dummies. So once that institutional knowledge is gone, it's never coming back. So Joe's point is that let's teach fishing. Let's find a way to pass along the fundamentals of fishing so that if and when the rules and regs are ever relaxed enough for other people to get into the game, at least people will know something about fishing. So after he's done on the water every day, he's still on the water, but he's just at the edge of it at a warehouse space that he rents, and he teaches the fundamentals of fishing. Men, women, younger, older. I don't think when I last talked to him, I don't think he has a single person who's taken any of his classes that holds a commercial fishing license. I don't think a single person, I know they don't, not a single person has a commercial fishing boat. I don't think any of them are likely to have either a license or a boat in the next year, next 2, 5 years, maybe never. And he's teaching the fundamentals. Where do you fish? What kind of fish would you be fishing for here? Where would you go? How long would it take to get there? What kind of boat would you need? What kind of bait would you need? How do you maintain a commercial boat? How do you fix a commercial boat's engine? How do you learn how to mend a net? Mending nets was something that Joe Sanfilippo learned to do when he was literally 6 years old. Because that's what young kids in Gloucester used to do on weekends, on nice days. They'd sit around on the dock and they would repair nets for their dads, their uncles, their grandfathers. That's going and gone. So he's teaching it again. Will it do anything in terms of bringing fishing back? Who knows? What I love about it is that it is a particular way of facing a struggle. And I think that's worthy of admiration. Sometimes the struggle is to go from bigger to something much, much, much smaller in terms of a single individual. Sometimes the struggle is about just one person, and sometimes it is about a physical struggle. We all have that at some point in our lives, some more than others. For Louis Escobar, it was a terrible accident. Louis was a rarity of rarities. Louis died about 2 years ago. Louis was a rarity of rarities. He was a farmer in Rhode Island. So that's rarity number one. You may know that Rhode Island is a relatively diminutive state, so not a lot of farming, and most of the farming in Rhode Island today is turf farming, right? To grow grass, where you don't need a lot of room. Not cannabis, but for lawns, right? And you don't need a lot of room. I've had a guy tell me, at 3.5 acres, I can make a business out of it, because they just grow grass, and then they cut it up in these carpet-like, and they roll it up, and they deliver it to your house, and they unroll. It's like a carpet, right? Instead of vacuuming it, you water it. Louis, rarity number 2, was a dairy farmer in Rhode Island. You do need land to dairy farm. You need land to graze a herd of cows, right? And he did very well. He did very well. He had a wonderful 4th-generation dairy farm at the top of Portsmouth, right up at the northern end of Aquidneck Island in Narragansett Bay. And he did very well. He created this wonderful dairy cooperative with the other 2 dairy farms in Rhode Island. And then about 20 years ago, he had a terrible, terrible accident. His tractor fell on him. And if you are lucky enough that such an accident would not have the tractor killing you outright, you're going to be injured from any such type mishap. And Louis was. He lost the use of both legs and had to get into a wheelchair to live, and had this, can't really see the tires, he had this electric wheelchair outfitted with these very thick, fat tires, and he tools around that farm, and he said that he was more productive since the accident, because now he was all about planning things, because there were people who he had to plan for. They had to know what to do, because there were people helping him who hadn't helped him before. And I'll tell you, it is a humbling experience to find yourself running along, trying to keep up with a guy in a wheelchair. But that was Louis. Sometimes, as any journalist will tell you, the struggle can be about getting the story out, any story. That may seem like, well, you get a story out, you just tell people. Well, you don't. I mean, if you're interested in telling people more than just word of mouth at the supermarket, you need some sort of platform, digital, broadcast, what have you, to be able to get the story out. And without that platform, it's very challenging to get a story out. You'd have to, interest, if you're not connected with such a platform, you have to interest people who are in covering the story, and that can be a real struggle. I feel very fortunate that, I have spent most of my career attached to a very dependable platform owned by the Hearst Corporation. So that takes all that worry about how will we get the story out. It puts the worry, where you want it to be, which is in what's the quality of the story we want to get out. But for Jerry Ann Boggess, it was about getting a story out, and it was a story that she figured a lot of people would be interested in hearing, and it was. She made a historical find, and that's saying something. For somebody who emigrated from Jamaica to southern New Hampshire in the 1970s, 2 little kids in tow, who grew up there and went on to college in New Hampshire. And Jerry Ann, although not a journalist, she could have been. I've always told her, you'd make a great journalist, because she has a lot of them wonderful, just sort of inherently skills of a journalist. She is, first of all, the tool number 1, which I always say is the single most important one, which is being just curious. Just curious about anything. She's curious, she's inquisitive, she asks great questions. Sometimes too many questions, but she asks great questions. She's a great dogged researcher. She really drills down and won't let go. Just ask some local political folks who she's drilled down into. She's a wonderful writer, and she's this great researcher. And when she moved to Milford, New Hampshire, which is a little town about 12 miles west of Nashua, right, so southern New Hampshire, she was interested in something, which was that there were not a lot of people who looked like Jerry Ann in Milford, New Hampshire. There aren't a lot of people who look like Jerry Ann in all of New Hampshire. Exactly. But in particularly in Milford, and she said, well, this is where I am, so this is what I'm going to drill down about. She was interested in whether or not she could find out if there had ever been somebody in Milford, New Hampshire, ever, who looked like her. She figured, if everybody tells me they've never even known an African-American person living in Milford, she figured, I wonder if there's ever been. Am I the first? She was not. But it was the fact that she was not that led to this incredible historical find, and it would ultimately lead to Jerry Ann doing what she does now, which was based on that very, very first research she did. Because today, Jerry Ann is the co-founder of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. Today that's not easy to say. Today she is its executive director, and it's just what it sounds like. It's the fact that you know that New Hampshire is there are not a lot of black people in New Hampshire, and so she has determined places all around New Hampshire where there is very often surprising and unexpected history, like right in Portsmouth Harbor, where a lot of people, including myself, are very surprised to find out that in Portsmouth, in the early, even into the mid-1800s, there were slave auctions, just like in Biloxi, Mississippi, or Shreveport, Louisiana, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now, what was the find that led to all this? The find was Harriet E. Wilson. So Harriet E. Wilson, unlike Jerry Ann, was a native of Milford, New Hampshire. She had been born there in the very early 1800s. And her early story sounds like something out of a movie or a Charles Dickens story, really, because she was born to a young black couple, could not afford another mouth to feed, and they swaddled this young girl into a wicker basket of blankets, and they left her on the front porch of a wealthy white family. And the family took her in, fortunately. She became the family's indentured servant. She was a very bright, engaging young woman, a voracious reader, loved to write, kept journals, and in 1859, Harriet E. Wilson became the very first black novelist to have a book published in North America. So that was a find. And then, dogged as she is as ever, Jerry Ann Boggess succeeded in 2006 in persuading her town, Milford, to create this wonderful memorial to Harriet E. Wilson. So our first diner, anybody ever been to the Windsor Diner? Anybody been to the Windsor? So the Windsor is a great diner, right on the line between, Cornish, New Hampshire and Windsor, Vermont. And speaking of rarity of rarities, Teresa Rhodes, who runs and owns the Windsor Diner, is a total rarity. And I have been in more than a few diners. And I've never encountered this. I have encountered, and it's a rarity to begin with, to be a woman who owns a diner outright, okay? There are women who have taken over for other people, dads, husbands, whatever. There are fewer women diner owners who have bought the diner themselves and running it. But in Teresa's case, not only does she own the diner, she runs it solo. Wow. No, let that sink in for a minute. I mean solo. Yeah. So you might think, well, how would that work? Well, so did I. So I'm in there the first time, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, and I couldn't get over it. So I was sitting on one of these stools right here, and Billy, who I'll get to in a moment, wasn't sitting there quite yet. And I'm sitting here, and she's standing right where she is. The key is right where she is there. She kept standing there, and she was working. She was working the grill. She would turn out front, give somebody a napkin or an extra fork. I saw her. She doesn't have that belt on there, does she? She had like a carpenter's tool belt because she had like extra napkins and extra silverware. And so sometimes, at one point, I saw somebody asked her something that was on this side of her, and she did this like LeBron James thing. I was like, what the? So I'm like watching. I said, and I got my arm in my like this, and I'm on the counter, and I'm watching her, and I said, Teresa, I got to ask you something. I said, you don't even have to look at me. Just keep working. But if you can entertain this question, I said, what am I missing? What's the trick You have no help here right now. There's whatever it was, 7 or 8 people. I said, and when you're in a diner, 7 or 8 people, 12 people, it doesn't matter. However many people are in the diner at any given time, everybody's at a different stage of their little diner journey, right? I mean, some people are eating, some people are waiting, some people are waiting to leave, some people, right? So it's not like everybody sits down. It's not like serving a one-course dinner. So I was trying to figure out, what is your trick that you're able to do this? She said, have you seen me move? I said, no. She said, you won't. I said, what do you mean? She said, this is my spot. I'm locked in, like my feet are in cement. It's the only way I can do it. So she's cooking. She's, people, if somebody needs to leave, she says, over here, hon, and she does the check. She goes back to cooking. Somebody needs a menu right over there, so she didn't have to move. And I said, well, how do you serve? She said, when I'm done with a dish? I said, yeah. She said, watch. So about a minute later, she finished this guy's plate of eggs, and she turned around, and she said, arms up. Everyone went like this at the counter, like a Frisbee. She uses Pam on the counter, right? So she knows it's going to slide right to wherever it's going on either end, right? And this guy received it like an expert, and all was good. So there was that to sort of digest, and then there was Billy Nye. So Billy Nye, when I tell you he is a long-time customer, I mean long time. So Billy Nye grew up in the diner. Billy Nye grew up in Windsor. His mom was a server at the diner, and he would come in there. He told me every day after school, little kid, he'd put his book bag down right here. He'd sit in that stool right there, and his mom would bring him a glass of milk and a slice of apple pie. And then he moved away. And he moved away. He was gone for about 50 years, apparently. And he moved back about 3 or 4 years ago to be closer to his older daughter and her family. And he was doing some house painting. And he said that he came back to town, and the first thing he did was go and see if the diner was still running. And he was so happy that it was running. And he came in, and his stool was right there, and no one was sitting in it. And now he wasn't sitting in it. And that was bothering me. And I said, wait, Billy, time out for 1 second. I got to ask. That's your stool, right? He said, oh, yeah, that was my stool every day. My mom wouldn't have let anybody sit there when I'm coming home from school. I said, well, why aren't you sitting in it? I said, this bothers me greatly. I mean, the diner could go away tomorrow. They're going to have to bronze that stool and stick it out on the sidewalk with your plaque with your name on it. Why aren't you sitting in that stool? And he said, no, that's a good question. He said, well, when I moved back, I came into the diner, and the stool was empty. And I was so delighted, and I said, I'm going to have myself a cup of coffee, not milk, a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. And he said, I went to sit in that stool, and then I thought to myself, I said, Billy, maybe it's time you graduated to the next stool. And he did. So resilience. I think that there is something about the quality of resilience that is like in the New Englander DNA. I do. If the weather, if nothing else. New Englanders, you have to be weather resilient. Look at this past week. You have to be weather resilient. You do not have to be weather resilient in San Diego. Okay? You don't. So I think there's a certain resilience that's built in. But I also think one thing for me that's very New England, and also speaks so eloquently to resilience is the only non-person example that I use in the book when it comes to resilience. New England's mill towns and cities. And specifically, the towns themselves are resilient. They've had to be. And the mill buildings themselves are like so resilient. First of all, they were not meant to be torn down. You ever kick the tires on one of those mill buildings, so to speak? They were not meant to be torn down. You just don't say, hey, let's take down that mill building. Good luck. Okay? Good luck. And all these mill towns and these mill cities, they all share the same basic biography. They really do. Even if they produce completely different things, textiles, shoes, hats, canes, whatever, they all share the same basic biography. They're all born and created in and around the late 1700s or so. They all go through a period where they create 100% employment in some cases, you know, by the late 19th century in places like Lowell, Lawrence. I mean, you want a job, you got a job. It was like, you know, 100% unemployment. And then they all share the same experience, where at some point in the 20th century, usually late 20th century at the latest, the mill owners, all these mill towns, doesn't matter whether we're talking about Woonsocket, Pawtucket, North Adams, Lowell, Lawrence, Lewiston, Maine, Biddeford, all same thing happened in all these places. The mill owners, in an effort to bring down costs and maximize profit, they looked for cheaper labor. And they found it first in the American South, and then when they had finished, you know, with what they could get there, they moved on to overseas in places like the Philippines and so forth. But these towns and cities obviously can't leave, right? So they stayed, and they went from knowing great prosperity to what life was like when the prosperity was all gone. And there was often massive unemployment. Those same mill buildings, you know, those mill buildings that you couldn't tear down, that were now empty and abandoned, they became havens for arson, drugs, crime of all kinds. And these small cities and towns that could barely afford it anyway still had to police them because you had lots of crime going on in and around them. And they already couldn't afford it as it was. They weren't bringing in any tax revenue. So they all experienced that same awful decline. And then, fortunately, in and around the 1990s, the national economy turned in a way that allowed companies, businesses, again, to be looking particularly, I mean, the best example is like biotech, right? So in and around the late 80s, the 90s, these companies that are burgeoning now because of the national economy, but they're also looking for spaces that have huge square footage. The mills were perfect. The mills were perfect for that kind of thing. And so these towns and cities, many of them, if not most, have begun to come back, which is a great thing to see, these public-private partnerships, places like Haverhill, which is one of the best examples. You had a place, you know, you had Haverhill with almost 30% unemployment in 1975, and now Haverhill has become a bedroom community for Boston, which would have been unthinkable 30 years ago, 20 years ago, but it's right on the commuter line, and people, all those mill buildings provided all kinds of residential space, apartments and condos and homes, and now people are commuting to Boston. And in Biddeford, it was a slightly different story, but again, much of the same theme, and often there is a person like Alan Cassavant in all of these stories. There's somebody, sometimes it's more than one man or woman, but there's often some person who people credit with being, you know, the right person at the right time in the right place, that was able to help bring some of these changes in and make some of these things happen. And Alan is such an unlikely hero, and yet he is a beloved hero. Longest serving mayor in Biddeford's history, but he didn't start out that way. He was a math teacher, track coach in Biddeford, fifth generation French Canadian kid, grew up in Biddeford, knows what it was like when on Saturday nights in the 1960s and early 70s, you could walk on Main Street on a Saturday night. Everybody flush with cash from being paid at the mill the day before, all the bars and restaurants and stores open till 10 o'clock at night. And then he remembers in high school in the 1980s, and you were lucky to find a store open during the daytime in Biddeford. But Alan, who's not a businessman, he's not necessarily, you know, he's not an investor, he's not a wealthy guy, but he's one of these irrepressibly confident, upbeat, forward-looking people who is able to get a variety of people, investors and business people, into a room and then say, this is what we need to do. How can we get to yes? How can we make this happen? And he did make it happen. Those mill buildings that were deserted 30 years ago, today, all kinds of multi-uses from biotech to some great outdoor activewear companies, a couple of great breweries, restaurants, cafes. There's a residential component to them. And many people in Maine refer to what's happened in Biddeford as the Biddescence today. The way he has brought it back, helped bring it back. He helped bring back something like the City Theater, which is a wonderful example all by itself of the comeback in Biddeford, Maine. The City Theater is one of these spaces in New England that you'll find in a lot of small New England towns. It's a very often 19th century, very often Victorian era, very often wood, sometimes brick, but they are like a town building, right? It's like could be, and they always have some public component. It's all public, but they often have some official component, like town hall or library. And then there is always attached to that in this same space some big public use hall. Right? Memorial hall, right? It would be something where they might have dances, they might have lectures. Charles Dickens spoke right there in the City Theater in the 19th century. And my friend Tim Sample, who's a wonderful humorist out of Maine, he was the last band to play, because by the 60s and 70s, they were trying to make some money in the City Theater by having concerts, rock concerts. So his band was the last band that played the City Theater. How bad was it by the time he played there in 1970, 71, whatever it was? So he's pointing right there, he's pointing to the far wall. And he said, it was so bad in here that the wallpaper was falling off the wall. You could see it, like moving if you looked at it. And he said what we found was, while we were playing, was that if you could get people out into the aisles and jumping up and down, we could, this is what you're doing in a band when you're playing the sixth set. He said we found that we could actually take bets on when that roll of wallpaper would reach the floor. That's how bad it was, right? And it got worse. A year after he played there, the city of Biddeford condemned outright the building. They blew out the back wall. They put in a couple of big industrial garage doors. And in the same spot where once Charles Dickens gave a lecture, the DPW was storing road salt. So that's how bad it got, but it is not that now. It is completely restored. Again, a wonderful public-private partnership. And just like Friends of the Library, Friends of the City Theater were able to restore completely. Tim was blown away. The Palace Diner, a great example of the comeback in Biddeford. So the Palace Diner was once a place that everybody met up. It was like everybody met up, right, at the Palace Diner. And then about 10 years ago, it closed. And it was closed for years. And the city just couldn't find anybody who wanted to reopen the Palace Diner. And then enter these two guys. So Greg Mitchell and Chad Conley would not have been your leading candidates to reopen a diner. Because first of all, they're real foodies. And by foodies, I mean they're accomplished chefs. Young guys, started, sous chefs and on the line, and then we're head chefs in a couple of restaurants in Portland. And if you know Portland, that's saying something, because Portland has become a real food mecca. And they wanted to start their own restaurants. People were like, you guys are so good, you should have your own restaurant. Well, they should also have $2 million, which they didn't have. So somebody told them about this diner in Biddeford, and they were like, we love diners as much as the next guy, but we're not diner cooks. We're just not. But they said, well, why don't you go down there? So remember our friend Alan Cassavant? Yeah. So Alan is a very, very imaginative guy when it comes to getting things done. So he was thinking, I don't know these guys. We desperately want to reopen the diner. I don't know what I can offer them as an inducement. Well, sure, they had already offered whoever was going to buy it all kinds of tax breaks on redoing the parking area in front and whatnot, but he was thinking, all I can do is appeal to their hearts. And so in his position as mayor, he was able to requisition a couple of school buses, and he was able to persuade a bunch of volunteers, and they came down to the diner while these two guys were inside checking it out. And they all had these signs that had been made, and they all said the exact same thing, and they didn't say anything except trot off the bus and hold up their signs. So while these two guys are in the diner looking out those windows into the parking area, they see about 200 people holding a sign that all said, please, for the love of God, buy me. And it worked. See, that's Alan's genius. That's Alan's genius. Sometimes you find resilience in places that you don't expect to find it, like a ski hill, like a little ski hill in Vermont. Although I must say these days, more and more, I'm expecting to see resilience when it comes to the ski industry because of climate change. But nonetheless, that's not the resilience that strikes me so much here at Northeast Slopes, where, incredibly, I was just there in that exact spot a week ago this past Thursday. And I'll tell you, it's a very interesting story at Northeast Slopes. So I don't know if you're familiar with East Corinth, Vermont. Probably not. It's a very tiny little town in Orange County, Vermont. So Orange County is that area that sort of moves up into the Upper Valley near Hanover on the New Hampshire side and Norwich on the Vermont side. And you know, I think, let me preface this by saying that I think when people think of Vermont, I think a lot of people think, understandably, of pockets of real affluence. And that's true. That is true. No question about it. Norwich, but also, you know, Stratton, Killington, Stowe. There is real affluence in Vermont. What's less well known is there is real poverty in Vermont. I mean poverty level and below poverty. And particularly in that area of East Corinth, Vermont. East Corinth, Randolph, Sharon, Stratford, South Stratford, lot of poverty. Those don't go together, skiing and poverty, especially today. I mentioned the ski industry. I'll mention it one more time if I have to, because I don't like to. I don't like the ski industry, and I say that as a lifelong skier. I started skiing when I was 5 years old. I still count myself as very fortunate to be able to ski today. I feel tremendously fortunate that I've been able to pass that love for skiing along to my two daughters, who, if I'm really lucky, I still get to ski with every now and then. And when I say lucky, when I say I feel fortunate, I don't mean in terms of finding the time or them, bingo. It's finding the money. Because a majority of people in America today cannot afford to ski. And it does not have to be that way. The ski industry made a very conscious decision about 35 years ago to make the sport very geared toward the wealthy and the affluent, which I think is obscene. And I despise the ski industry, but I love skiing. Any of you ski? Any of you skied? Yeah? Yeah. So this is not Killington. What was your first clue? You will not find any high-price quad lifts. There isn't a chairlift. You will not find any slopeside condos. You will also, though, not find any kid left behind if they want to ski. You cannot say that at Killington. Oh, really? You're a family that's not prepared to pay $3,500 for a weekend of skiing? Bye. So that's the thing about East Corinth. It's a poor town. So why is there a ski hill there? There's been a ski hill there since the 1930s, okay? But after that had closed about 40 years ago, and a group came together, a local group came together interested in getting the ski area up and running again, they had to confront the reality that things had changed somewhat in East Corinth, Vermont. And it was now a community where many people could not even think of skiing. If you had 2 or 3 kids, you were not going out and spend, how quaint, I was going to say 100. So today, to ski at Stowe on a weekend, you'll be paying almost $250. And there's an area in Colorado today, whose name I won't utter, that is the first to break the $300 a day lift ticket in America. That's not a high-priced lift ticket. That's an obscenity. So nonetheless, they had to confront the fact that they're in a community now, they want to reopen the ski hill, and a lot of people can't afford to ski. Can't afford to ski. They never mind afford ski equipment for 2 or 3 kids. That's not happening. So they went through all kinds of, discussion about, how they should price it. And then somebody at one point, one of the people I love most in all New England, Wade Pearson, said, I got an idea, people. We'll charge nothing. That's what we'll charge, which ended up being how it went, making Northeast Slopes one of three nonprofit ski areas in all of America today. I love that. Nonprofit ski area to me is the biggest oxymoron of all. Forget jumbo shrimp. Nonprofit ski area. There is nothing about the ski business today that isn't about maximum profit. So I love the fact, so they're a nonprofit. Now, if you can afford to contribute, you do. Like a museum, like many museums, right? There's no charge. If you can afford to contribute, you can contribute, you can't. But the wonderful thing about this is that Wade's point was, it isn't enough that people who can't afford to ski won't pay to ski. There must be no stigmatism whatsoever, no stigma about the fact that people, no one knows. So you go here, these kids get off the bus at the end of the school day, they go to ski. Nobody knows if you're paying to ski or not. You need ski equipment? You trot over to the ski library, this wonderful ski bus that's full of equipment donated from ski shops all over Vermont. And it's this wonderful way that the community met the community where they were, which was that a lot of people couldn't afford to do what they were intending to do, and therefore we'll make it possible for everybody to ski anyway. So I first visited about 5 years ago. On that day, Wade was running the rope tow there. That old rope tow, pictured in the 1930s there, is today the longest continuously running ski lift in North America, and it goes like hell. And I remember I brought my skis, and I was thinking, I'm going to take a little run down the hill. I'll take the rope tow, and I'm looking at this thing, and it was moving so fast. So the rope tow is normally, it's going along until you pick it up. It's going along on the surface of the snow. This thing, the friction of this thing going so fast, had burrowed about a 2-foot chasm in the ground, and I knew I had to fish it out of there and get at that. And I said to Wade, what do you have running this thing? What, do you got a jet engine in that shed? And he said, well, not a jet engine. But he's very, very proud of his 73 Dodge Dart with the slant 6, and he obsesses over that, and it is still purring, as he puts it. So how much money did I spend? Because obviously I was going to contribute, and he would only accept what they would charge someone if they were charging someone, which was $10.50. So I spent $10.50 for a ticket. I spent another $6 for a delicious nor'easter burger in their little lodge. I say lodge. It's half lodge, half tool shed, all combined. And I'll tell you, $16.50, honest to God, I don't know if $16.50 would buy you a large soft drink at Vail, Colorado today. In and around, you might have $2 to spare. And it restored my faith. I was talking about the ski industry, but it not only restored my faith in having a wonderful day skiing, much more importantly, it restored my faith in community. It really did. It really did. So I do want to add one thing about resilience, and that is, it's not so much this person being resilient, Becky Rule, but the fact that she recognizes, as much as anyone I've ever met, and I'm sure you'd agree, that oftentimes resilience is really a part, humor is really a part of being resilient. Finding a way to somehow grin and bear it, to find a way to smile through a tough patch. Look, there's days when you're not going to smile. You can't smile, you can't laugh, you don't want to hear a joke, and that's just the way it is. But I guarantee, even on a day like that, Becky would be trying to get at you to make you smile. She's a wonderful, funny lady. She lives in Northwood, New Hampshire. She's a writer. She does a lot of speaking. She's a wonderful author. She's written a ton of books, all about aspects of New England, like New England lore and New England humor. I love her last book. So her last book was called Headin' for the Rhubarb. Right? And it's wonderful. What's wonderful about it, it's like a glossary of old New Englandisms, right? Terms, and the title itself. So I'm not a horse person, so I didn't know that apparently rhubarb, right, is really, really bad for horses. Like, I won't kill them, but if you had a horse that was heading for the rhubarb, you want to get that horse back, right? It's going to make them really, really sick, right? And so over time, that expression started apparently to be used by people just to refer to anybody who's headed for trouble of any kind, not rhubarb, right? So I love the example she uses in her book is she said, you might have two old friends who are sitting on the front porch of the local general store one morning, right? And they're sitting there, they got their feet up on the porch railing, and they're having some coffee, and they see another friend of theirs come walking up the street, and he's walking arm in arm with his new lady friend. And one of the guys says to the other one, I'll tell you right now, Jimmy, he is heading for the rhubarb at that one. Heading for the rhubarb at that one. So, you want to try your luck on a New Englandism? That'll do for you. Okay, so I was looking at that term on the page with Becky. I'm sitting out in the back of her house there a couple of years ago in the fall. It was a beautiful fall day, and she's quizzing me, and I said, I don't get it. She said, Adelphia. I said, it's not a place? It's not like Philadelphia? Philadelphia? What? She said, no. I said, well, use it in a sentence. She said, fine. She said, I might need to pick up a couple of things, so I might run next door to Barrington, New Hampshire, at Caliph's General Store, and I might pick up a few things and throw them in my basket, and I'll go up to the counter, and Tina at the counter might say to me, all right, hon, Adelphia? You get it? I didn't get it. So apparently it was an intelligence test, and I flunked. So let's finish on a nice up note and triumph, right? We all like to triumph, although we all know that sometimes to win and triumph, you first have to experience failure. The problem is that when failure involves drug abuse, frequently failure is fatal, right? And that's certainly the case, would have been the case for Larson Ojala. Larson grew up in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, so Fitzwilliam and Jaffrey, New Hampshire are the two towns that are straddled by Mount Monadnock. And when he was growing up there, he used to love, after school, to run up and down, see how many times he could run up and down Mount Monadnock until he had to go in and it was getting dark. Now, most people do not run up Mount Monadnock, where the average hiker takes between 3¼ to 4 hours to hike up to the summit and back down. So he was doing this running, but he wasn't doing any running at all by the time he was a teenager. He had begun abusing drugs by the time he was 10. By the time he was 13 and 14, he had graduated to some pretty serious stuff like fentanyl and heroin, and he was going nowhere good. In fact, he was going where, by his count, at least half a dozen kids that he knew in school went, which is to the graveyard. And if he had not been lucky enough to been one of those few people who was able to make a decision to stop abusing drugs, that's what would have happened to him. He's sure of it. He's sure of it. But he did. He was very lucky that, first of all, he was able to make that decision for himself, which is where obviously it has to start. He was doubly lucky that he had a loving family who had already been through hell and back with him, but was still there supporting him. And he was triply lucky in that he had a wonderful mentor in his recovery who was one of those extreme hikers. And Larson took that as his recovery goal, that one day I will run up and down Mount Monadnock again. As he tells me, the folks and the staff at the recovery center, when they would hear this, would say, I'll tell you what, champ, why don't we see if you're lucky enough to get your feet onto the floor in the morning and walk to breakfast, and maybe you'll worry about running up a mountain later. He did, and he recovered. And he has been clean and sober for over a decade now. He's married, has a couple of wonderful kids, has his own concrete business in Fitzwilliam, travels the country hiking, and true to his goal, in 2021, Larson Ojala set a new world record. 17 summits in 24 hours, running up and down Mount Monadnock, no stopping, nothing but running. So, and then a year later, he set a new world record, beating his own. 18 summits in 24 hours, which is extraordinary, right? Now, I knew he was doing that over the period of a Saturday and a Sunday morning, so I texted him on Sunday morning when I knew he'd be down, and I said, congratulations, man. You are running free. And he texted me back about an hour later, and he said, thanks, Ted. Next time, how about you do it with me? And I almost put my thumb out of commission, I think maybe setting my own record for number of laughing emojis. But you know, let me finish with my favorite story. My favorite story. Anybody in here ever heard of, familiar with, seen the Goodnight Lights in Providence? You have, yeah. sort of hard to describe, right? If you're going to say, well, describe that, right? The Goodnight Lights phenomenon, which will be happening in, just about 5 hours from now at 8:30 tonight. It happens every night at 8:30, rain or shine, all year long. And what is extraordinary about the Goodnight Lights phenomenon is that this is a city, Providence, that has found an ingenious way to say goodnight every night to some people who often feel that they are forgotten, which are younger children who are undergoing treatment for cancer or leukemia at Hasbro Children's Hospital in Providence. And this man right here, Steve Brosnahan, is responsible for it. When I say responsible, it was his idea, it was his genius of an idea, and he worked very hard for almost 10 years now to make this a reality. And today, you don't say phenomenon, that's a word you use carefully, and it is a phenomenon. It is now being copied in cities around the country. Steve Brosnahan would be a very wealthy man if he had, say, trademarked it or copyrighted, but that would not be Steve Brosnahan. Steve is one of the most lovely human beings I've ever met. He is kind, he's gentle, he's soft-spoken, he's generous, he's patient, he's funny, he has grace. You don't say that about a lot of people. He likes to joke that he's the lowest paid member of the medical staff at Hasbro Children's. I'm always quick to point out to him, a lot of that has to do with the fact, Steve, that you are the only member of the medical staff without a medical degree. I mean, to which he will agree, and then he will point out one more distinction which nobody would argue with, which is that Steve Brosnahan is also the only member of the medical staff at Hasbro Children's that children, patients, are actually delighted to see when he arrives at their door. Because Steve is a cartoonist. He's an artist. And he spends his day going room to room, and he would say that he is teaching kids how to draw, how to paint. That's not it. He's taking their minds off what is consuming them. He's offering a respite for 60 minutes from fear. And he's doing it in a way that makes them laugh, which is something they may do only that one time during an entire day. He arrives with his buckets of markers and crayons and paints and his big sketchbooks, and they start creating other worlds together. And it's a wonder to see. And he had become friendly about 10 years ago with a young kid who was about to be released from the hospital. Right? So Steve, had become fond of him, and he wanted to do some kind of special goodbye. And when he's talking to the kid, he realizes that the kid's room faces out the front of the hospital. And Steve rides his bike to and from work, and he realized that he'll be walking his bike right out underneath this kid's room. So he said, I'll tell you what. He said, tonight at 8:30, when he knew it would be dark, he said, look out the window, right down there, and you're going to have a surprise. And sure enough, when Steve walked his bike out that night at 8:30, he detached his powerful bike flashlight, he shined it up at the kid's room, and he flashed it on and off, and he waved, and he turned to go. And to hear Steve tell it, apparently it had rained that afternoon. And you know how after it rains, when there's puddles on pavement, lights really reflect, right? And he said, I saw this light reflecting, and I thought my flashlight was still on, and it wasn't. And I looked up at the kid's room, and he had just instinctively realized he could respond by turning his room light on and off. And Steve said it was the biggest aha moment of his whole life. He said, I realized I could do, and then every kid in every room could do what just happened here. I could do it for every kid in this hospital when they are released, God willing. And then he looked out at the city, and he said, wow, what if I made it bigger than just me? And he did. So he had a very simple ask. He approached every business in that area of Providence, every major hotel, every coffee shop, every bar, every tavern, every restaurant. He approached the police. He approached the universities, Brown and Providence College, and he approached the tug and the barge companies on the Providence River. All the same ask. 1 minute. That's all I'm asking. Just 1 minute. Flash your lights for the kids in the hospital. You don't have to hire more people. You can put it on a timer. 1 minute. Did they all get on board right away? Of course not. That's not the way it works. Are they almost all on board? If you stood in front of Hasbro Children's Hospital tonight or any night at 8:30 and faced with the hospital at your back and faced out to the city, and you didn't know what was going on, you'd say, what the hell's going on? Is there like a power surge? Is there a blackout about to happen? Because all the lights would be flashing on and off. They now call it the magic minute, and it has graduated to something very different than that first time. All the kids gather at the top of the hospital now in this redesigned solarium with these wraparound big windows so that all the kids can see the lights. They all have their own flashlights so they can all do what that first kid did and respond, in their way. The police departments and the fire departments get into it. And so I'm reading about this story. I was like, we got to do this story. So I got in touch with Steve Brosnahan. I introduced myself and I said, Steve, we'd love to come down and do a story on Goodnight Lights. He said, great, we'd love to have you. I said, so we're talking about it and how to do it. And I said, one other thing, Steve, it's very important. We would like to do it, I would like to do it in terms of seeing it through the perspective of one of the kids there who really, really loves. Like, this is the high point of their day. He said, well, it's the high point of most of these patients' day. I said, well, can you find me one that we could potentially visit with and see how they like it that night? And he said, well, let me see what I can do. Before that day was over, he called me back. He said, I have the perfect patient for you. I said, great. He said, yep, she is into it. Her parents are okay with it. I said, great. And he was absolutely right. So sorry. Abby Waldron was the perfect patient. She, there were a lot of people around that afternoon. We spent about 5 hours there in the afternoon, just the afternoon. And a lot of people, word got out, people filter over, what's going on? And, staff and friends of her family, blah, blah, blah. There were a lot of people. And the only person who I realized at some point in the afternoon, the only person who all day had never stopped smiling and laughing was the patient. And about 5 o'clock or so, I said, Abby, we're going to have to take a break. And she said, well, you got to stay for Goodnight Lights. And I said, what do you think we're doing here? What do you think we're doing here? I said, in fact, you have a job tonight at Goodnight Lights because you have to save me a seat next to you, because that's the whole thing. She said, okay. And we did. And I sat right next to her. And that is, you can see the logo. That was from the show that aired in April 2018 on the Goodnight Lights, and Abby Waldron. And she said at the end of that night, she said, it was like the grand finale tonight. And 1 year later, May 2019, that story won an Emmy Award. And the only reason I say that is because when that happened, I realized that this needed to be shared with the people who actually created this story. And so that Sunday morning, that was a Saturday night, Sunday morning, I called Steve and I called Abby's parents and I asked them all if they could meet me on Monday morning outside the hospital at 10 o'clock. And they all said yes. And we did, and I was able to share that with Steve and Abby Waldron, now 16 and cancer-free. Awesome. That's a triumph, right? Yeah. That's a triumph. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.